January 5th, 1943. Dawn breaks over the Solomon Islands, and aboard the cruiser USS Helena, Lieutenant Commander William "Red" Cochrane stands behind his 5-inch gun mount, watching the horizon. His crew has been at battle stations for 3 hours. The air smells of salt and cordite and fear. Then the call crackles over the sound-powered phone. Bogies inbound, bearing 040, range 12,000 yards and closing fast. 2 Aichi Type 99 dive bombers, their pilots veterans of Pearl Harbor and Midway, drop from the cloud layer and begin their attack run. They've done this dozens of times before. They know the American anti-aircraft fire. They've learned to jink and weave through the black puffs of timed explosions that always detonate too early or too late. They understand the mathematics of survival. What they don't understand is that everything has changed. Cochrane's crew fires 3 salvos, just 5 to 6 shells. In 90 seconds, both Japanese aircraft disintegrate in mid-air, torn apart by explosions that shouldn't have been possible. The pilots never even had time to wonder what killed them. Their aircraft simply ceased to exist, as if erased by an invisible hand. This is the story of the VT proximity fuse, a weapon so revolutionary that it remained one of the war's most closely guarded secrets. A device so effective that Japanese pilots called American anti-aircraft fire black magic because they couldn't comprehend how shells were finding them with such impossible precision. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. It's the story of how American scientists crammed a working radar system into a 5-inch artillery shell, how they made it survive forces 20,000 times the pull of gravity, and how they turned near misses into kills. And it's the story of what happened when Japanese aviators, trained to exploit every weakness in American naval defense, suddenly discovered that the Americans had made the sky itself lethal. To understand the revolution, we must first understand the problem. October 1942, somewhere in the Pacific. Commander Takeo Shibata pilots his Mitsubishi Type 0 fighter in a strafing run against an American destroyer. He's been briefed extensively on American anti-aircraft capabilities. The intelligence is thorough and comforting. American 5-inch guns, his squadron commander explained, use timed fuses. The shells are set before firing to explode at a predetermined altitude. This requires the American gunners to calculate the target's speed, altitude, and bearing, then estimate where the aircraft will be several seconds in the future. It's a complex problem with dozens of variables. The math is difficult enough when the target maintains a steady course. When the target is a fighter plane pulling high G turns and constantly changing altitude, the math becomes nearly impossible. Japanese pilots have learned that if you vary your approach, jinking left and right, climbing and diving unpredictably, American anti-aircraft fire becomes little more than a spectacular but harmless fireworks display. Shibata watches the black puffs of explosions blooming around his aircraft. They're always behind him or ahead of him or above him or below him, but never exactly where he is. It's like trying to swat a fly by predicting where it will be in 2 seconds. The fly will always win. The statistics support his confidence. In 1941 and early 1942, American anti-aircraft guns require an average of 2,000 rounds to bring down a single aircraft. 2,000 5-inch shells, each weighing 55 pounds, each costing approximately $30 to manufacture and fire, to destroy one airplane. The mathematics are devastating to American naval defense. A single destroyer carries perhaps 400 rounds of 5-inch ammunition. If lucky, she might shoot down one aircraft before running dry. Meanwhile, Japanese bombers and torpedo planes attack in formations of 20, 30, sometimes 50 aircraft. The numbers don't add up. Back in Washington, the Bureau of Ordnance understands the crisis. They've known about it since before the war began. In 1939 and 1940, as war consumed Europe and tensions rose with Japan, American naval planners watched British attempts to defend their fleet against the Luftwaffe. The results were sobering. British anti-aircraft gunnery, considered among the best in the world, was failing catastrophically. German bombers operating over the English Channel and North Sea routinely attacked British ships with near impunity. The problem wasn't British skill or courage. The problem was fundamental to the physics of anti-aircraft fire. An artillery shell leaves the gun barrel travelling at approximately 2,600 feet per second. It takes several seconds to reach altitude. During those seconds, a maneuvering aircraft might change position by hundreds of feet. The gunner must predict not where the aircraft is, but where it will be when the shell arrives. With a timed fuse, the gunner must also predict the exact range and set the fuse accordingly. Too short, and the shell explodes harmlessly below the target. Too long, and it explodes after the aircraft has passed. The window for a successful hit is measured in fractions of a second across a three-dimensional battle space where everything is moving. It's not gunnery, it's prophecy, and prophecy is not a reliable basis for naval defense. Admiral Harold Stark, Chief of Naval Operations, writes in a memorandum dated August 1940, "The vulnerability of our fleet to air attack represents our single greatest weakness. We can outbuild the Japanese in ships. We cannot afford to lose those ships to aircraft we cannot shoot down. We need a solution, and we need it before the shooting starts." The solution, when it comes, will emerge not from the Navy's ordnance bureaus or from professional gunners, but from civilian physicists working in a converted garage in Silver Spring, Maryland. Men who understand that sometimes you have to teach a piece of metal to think for itself. Dr. Merle Anthony Tuve sits in his office at the Carnegie Institution's Department of Terrestrial Magnetism in Washington, D.C., studying a problem that dozens of researchers have already declared impossible. It's August 1940. War is coming. Everyone knows it. And the Navy has just asked him to perform a miracle. They want a fuse that will automatically detonate an artillery shell when it gets close to an aircraft. Not on contact. Contact is too difficult to achieve. Not at a preset time. Time fuses are too unreliable. They want a fuse that can sense its target and destroy it. They want artillery shells that can hunt. The concept isn't new. Military theorists have discussed proximity fuses for decades. Others have proposed acoustic fuses that listen for engine noise or magnetic systems that sense metal. All have failed. The technical challenges are staggering. First, you must fit a working detection system into a 5-inch artillery shell that's already packed with 7 pounds of high explosive. The space available is roughly equivalent to a pint milk bottle. Second, this detection system must survive being fired from a gun. The acceleration is approximately 20,000 times the force of gravity. For reference, modern astronauts experience about 3 Gs during launch. 20,000 Gs is enough to turn solid metal into something resembling putty. Glass shatters. Solder joints separate. Vacuum tubes implode. Third, the shell spins as it flies, rotating at up to 30,000 revolutions per minute due to the rifling in the gun barrel. This creates centrifugal force that tries to tear every component apart from the inside. Fourth, the whole system must work reliably at temperatures ranging from 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the Pacific to -50 degrees in the North Atlantic. It must function in rain, snow, fog, and salt spray. It must store safely for months and then activate perfectly on first use. And finally, it must be cheap enough to manufacture by the hundreds of thousands. The Navy needs millions of these devices. They need them soon, and they need them to work. Tuve assembles a team. Dr. James Van Allen, a young physicist who will later discover Earth's radiation belts, tackles the problem of creating vacuum tubes that can survive the shock of firing. Lloyd Berkner works on the radio circuitry. Dozens of others attack individual components, the battery, the fuse mechanism, the safety systems. They settle on a radio-based approach. The fuse will contain a miniature transmitter that sends out continuous radio waves. When those waves bounce off a nearby aircraft and return to a receiver built into the same fuse, the signal triggers the detonator. It's radar in miniature, simple in concept, nightmarishly complex in execution. The vacuum tube problem alone requires months of work. Standard vacuum tubes use thin glass envelopes that shatter instantly under high acceleration. Van Allen and his team experiment with thicker glass, different mounting systems, alternative tube designs. They build test rigs that subject prototype tubes to 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 Gs. Most explode. Some survive. Those that survive get tested again. By late 1941, they have tubes that work, sort of. The reliability rate is perhaps 30%. 3 out of 10 fuses activate correctly. The other 7 are duds, expensive paperweights that cost $30 each and do absolutely nothing. The Navy looks at 30% reliability and makes a decision that will save thousands of lives. They accept it. 30% is better than the near-zero success rate of timed fuses. They order 5,000 fuses for immediate deployment, with the understanding that Section T2V's group will keep working to improve the design. The project expands rapidly. By early 1942, it's outgrown the Carnegie facilities. The Navy contracts with Johns Hopkins University to sponsor a new laboratory. They call it the Applied Physics Laboratory, APL. Its first address is a converted used car dealership in Silver Spring. The building still smells of motor oil and tire rubber when the scientists move in. Production begins. The Crosley Corporation, better known for manufacturing radios and refrigerators, retool their factories to build fuses. General Electric's Christmas tree light facility in Cleveland switches to producing miniature vacuum tubes. Across America, over 100 factories and 10,000 workers become part of secrets so closely guarded that most of them never know what they're building. The fuses are code-named VT variable time, a deliberately misleading designation that suggests they're just improved timed fuses. Workers in the factories handle components without knowing how they fit together. Even the Navy gun crews who will fire the shells receive only minimal information. They're told the fuses are experimental and highly secret. They're not told how they work. The reason for secrecy is simple. If the Japanese or Germans capture an intact fuse, they might either copy the technology or develop countermeasures. Either outcome would negate years of work and billions of dollars in investment. So the fuses are initially restricted to naval use over open ocean, where a dud will sink to the bottom rather than fall into enemy hands. Commander William Sterling Parsons, who will later arm the atomic bomb aboard Enola Gay, personally escorts the first combat shipment to the Pacific in late 1942. He carries 500 fuses aboard the cruiser Helena and observes their first use in January 1943. The test comes during a Japanese bombing raid. Helena's gun crews fire their new ammunition at incoming dive bombers. The results exceed even optimistic predictions. Both aircraft are destroyed. The crews can hardly believe what they've witnessed. Shells that seem to miss suddenly explode right next to their targets. Aircraft that should have survived disintegrate in mid-air. But the real shock isn't felt aboard Helena. It's felt in the cockpits of surviving Japanese pilots, men who return to base with stories that their commanders initially refused to believe. Flight Petty Officer Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's leading aces with over 60 confirmed kills, lands his Zero fighter at Rabaul in February 1943. He climbs from the cockpit shaking. His aircraft is undamaged, but something happened during his attack run that he cannot explain. He tried to strafe an American destroyer. Standard tactic: come in low and fast, rake the deck with machine gun fire, pull up before the anti-aircraft guns can track you. He's done it 100 times. But this time, as he approached, the air around his aircraft simply exploded, not in front of him or behind him or above him, but right next to his wings, as if the shells knew exactly where he was. His wingman wasn't as lucky. Sakai watched the other Zero disintegrate, torn apart by an explosion that occurred nowhere near where the anti-aircraft burst should have been. There was no black puff of smoke to dodge. There was just sudden, instantaneous destruction. The intelligence officer debriefing him asks about the altitude of the anti-aircraft bursts, trying to determine the American fuse settings. Sakai struggles to explain. There were no altitude patterns. The explosions happened wherever the aircraft happened to be. It was as if the shells had eyes. Similar, reports are flooding into Japanese naval air stations across the South Pacific. Pilots describe anti-aircraft fire that behaves in ways that shouldn't be possible. Shells that detonate at the precise moment they pass an aircraft. Formations that are torn apart by explosions that seem to track individual planes. Success rates that are dropping month by month. By mid-1943, Japanese naval aviation commanders are confronting a disturbing statistical reality. In 1942, they could expect roughly 75% of their aircraft to survive anti-aircraft fire from American ships. By mid-1943, that number has dropped to 60%. By late 1943, it's approaching 50%. The Americans, somehow, have fundamentally changed the equation of air-sea combat, and Japanese intelligence cannot determine how they've done it. What the Japanese don't know what they cannot know is that inside every VT-fused shell is a device that would seem like science fiction if they could examine it. A radio transmitter, smaller than a pack of cigarettes. A receiver sensitive enough to detect reflections from an aircraft 200 feet away. A vacuum tube that can withstand forces that would pulverize concrete. The physics are elegant. The transmitter sends out radio waves at approximately 180 MHz, the frequency range used by modern FM radio. These waves spread out in a cone ahead of the shell. When they strike a metal object, some of the energy reflects back toward the shell. The receiver picks up this reflected signal. As the shell gets closer to the aircraft, the reflected signal gets stronger. When the signal strength crosses a predetermined threshold, indicating the shell is within the lethal radius of its explosive charge, approximately 70 feet, the fuse detonates. The entire system must make this decision in milliseconds. The shell is traveling at over 2,000 feet per second. At that speed, 70 feet represents about 35 thousandths of a second. The electronics must detect the target, process the signal, and trigger the detonation in less time than it takes to blink. And it works. Not perfectly, the failure rate remains around 30% throughout the war. But 70% success is revolutionary, compared to the near-zero success rate of timed fuses against maneuvering targets. The impact on ammunition consumption is dramatic. Where American ships previously fired 2,000 rounds to destroy one aircraft, with VT fuses they fire an average of 500 rounds per kill. Some engagements, like Helena's first combat use, require fewer than 10 rounds per aircraft destroyed. For the sailors manning the guns, the psychological impact is profound. Previously, anti-aircraft fire felt like throwing rocks at birds. You might get lucky, but mostly you just made noise and hoped the enemy would go away. With VT fuses, every shot has a realistic chance of killing. Gun crews begin to believe they can actually defend their ships. For Japanese pilots, the psychological impact is devastating. They've trained extensively on defeating American anti-aircraft fire. They've learned the timing of American fuses, the effective ranges of different guns, the gaps in coverage. Suddenly, all that training is worthless. The shells find them regardless of altitude, speed, or maneuvers. Some pilots report that American anti-aircraft fire has become suicidally accurate. Others claim the Americans must have developed some form of radio-controlled shells that follow aircraft like homing torpedoes. The truth that the shells contain miniature radar systems is beyond their ability to conceive in 1943. But the VT fuse's impact extends far beyond simple kill statistics. It forces Japanese commanders to fundamentally rethink their air operations doctrine. November 1943. Combined Fleet Headquarters, Truk, Atoll. Admiral Minachi Koga, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, reviews operational reports from the Solomon Islands. The numbers are stark, and getting worse. Japanese naval aviation is being ground down not primarily by American fighters, though those are deadly enough, but by American anti-aircraft fire that has become unexpectedly lethal. His intelligence staff has analyzed hundreds of combat reports. They've identified patterns in American anti-aircraft effectiveness that suggest some new technology. But they cannot determine what it is. American ships operating in formations achieve kill rates 4 to 5 times higher than previously observed. Even isolated ships are dramatically more deadly. The Imperial Navy begins changing tactics in response. Attack profiles shift to higher speeds and lower altitudes, trying to minimize exposure time to anti-aircraft fire. Strike packages increase in size if the Americans are killing a higher percentage of attacking aircraft. You need to launch more aircraft to achieve the same damage. But these adaptations have costs. High speed, low altitude attacks give pilots less time to aim and reduce accuracy. Larger strike packages require more aircraft and more pilots, resources that Japan is increasingly unable to spare. The Americans are forcing Japan into a war of attrition, and attrition is a war Japan cannot win. What Japanese commanders don't fully realize is that the VT fuse is just reaching operational maturity. By late 1943, production has ramped up dramatically. Ships that initially received a few dozen VT-fused rounds now receive hundreds. The fuses themselves have improved reliability climbs from 30% to 50%, then to 70% by 1944. And the Navy is learning how to use them more effectively. Fire control procedures are updated, gun crews receive specialized training. The Mark 37 Fire Control Director, which coordinates main battery, anti-aircraft fire, is modified to better exploit VT fuse capabilities. The combination of better fuses and better tactics creates a multiplier effect. By early 1944, American ships with full VT ammunition loadouts are achieving kill rates that would have been considered impossible 2 years earlier. April 19, 44, Saipan. Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okumiya, an experienced naval aviator and tactical officer, compiles an analysis of American anti-aircraft capabilities for Vice Admiral Kakuji Kakuta, commander of the 1st Air Fleet. His conclusions are sobering. American anti-aircraft defense has become so effective that conventional attack methods are no longer viable. Aircraft attacking American task forces face survival rates below 50%. Even successful attacks that penetrate to drop range typically result in mission kills on only 10 to 15% of ships attacked. The mathematics are unsustainable. Okumiya's report includes a section that will prove grimly prophetic. He notes that conventional attacks require pilots to approach, aim, release weapons, and escape a sequence that exposes the aircraft to anti-aircraft fire for up to 60 seconds. But what if the pilot didn't try to escape? What if the aircraft itself became the weapon? If a pilot deliberately crashed his aircraft into a ship, the exposure time drops to perhaps 15 seconds. More importantly, the ship cannot defeat the attack by damaging the aircraft. You must completely destroy the plane before it reaches the ship. Minor damage that would force a conventional bomber to turn away means nothing to a pilot who's already committed to death. This analysis circulates through Japanese Naval Aviation Command. It plants seeds that will germinate into the Kamikaze program later that year, and when Kamikaze attacks begin in October 1944, the VT fuse will prove even more critical than anyone anticipated. But before the Kamikazes come, there's one more chapter in the VT fuse story that demonstrates both its power and its limitations. June 1944, the Philippine Sea. Admiral Raymond Spruance's 5th Fleet faces the largest Japanese carrier operation since Midway. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commands 9 carriers and 470 aircraft. The resulting battle will be called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, and VT fuses will play a starring role. The battle begins on June 19th, when Japanese search planes locate the American fleet. Ozawa launches massive strike wave 69 aircraft in the first wave, 128 in the second. He's betting everything on a decisive engagement. What Ozawa doesn't know is that American carrier task forces are now optimized for exactly this kind of air defense. Combat air patrols of Hellcat fighters vector onto the incoming raids while they're still 60 miles out. But the fighters can't stop everything. Some Japanese aircraft inevitably break through. That's where the VT fuse proves its worth. The outer defense screen battleships and cruisers with 5-inch guns loaded with VT ammunition opens fire at ranges exceeding 10,000 yards. The Japanese pilots, already harassed by fighters, fly into a wall of precisely detonating shells. The inner defense screen destroyers and light cruisers fires 40mm and 20mm guns for close-in defense. But it's the 5-inch VT fused shells that do the heavy lifting. They create what American officers will later describe as a steel umbrella, a layer of aerial destruction through which few aircraft can pass intact. By day's end, the Japanese have lost approximately 350 aircraft. American losses are 30 planes. The kill ratio is nearly 12-1, the most lopsided aerial victory in naval history. American pilots joke that it was like an old-time turkey shoot back home. The name sticks. The VT fuse doesn't deserve sole credit for the victory. American fighters and pilot skill matter enormously. But post-war analysis will show that VT-fused anti-aircraft fire accounted for nearly half of Japanese aircraft destroyed by the fleet. Without it, far more Japanese planes would have reached their targets, and American casualties would have been significantly higher. But even as American commanders celebrate the victory at Philippine Sea, they know a new threat is coming. Japanese intelligence has finally started to piece together the reality of American anti-aircraft capabilities, and their response will be to embrace the one tactic that conventional anti-aircraft fire, even with VT fuses, struggles to defeat. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. October 1944, Mabalacat Airfield, Philippines. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi addresses a group of young pilots. These are not Japan's elite aviators. Those men died over the Solomons, at Midway, in the Marianas Turkey Shoot. These are barely trained replacements, boys with perhaps 50 hours of flight time, facing American pilots with 500 hours or more. Onishi explains that conventional tactics no longer work. American combat air patrols are too strong. American anti-aircraft fire is too accurate. Even if you penetrate the defenses, drop your bomb, and try to escape, your chances of survival are essentially zero. But there's another way. If you deliberately crash your aircraft into an American ship, filled with fuel and loaded with a bomb, you become a guided missile. No defense can reliably stop. One plane, one pilot, one ship, certain death in exchange for certain damage. He calls it Tokko Special Attack. The Americans will call it Kamikaze Divine Wind. And it will prove to be the most effective anti-ship tactic the Japanese developed during the entire war. The first organized kamikaze attack occurs on October 25th during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. 50 fighters, each carrying a 250-kilogram bomb, deliberately crash into American escort carriers. The USS Street, Low explodes and sinks. 5 other carriers suffer damage. 5 aircraft, 5 pilots, 1 carrier sunk and 5 damaged. By conventional attack standards, it's an impossible exchange ratio. And here the VT fuse faces its greatest challenge. The mathematics of anti-aircraft defense assume that damaged aircraft will break off their attacks. A shell that wounds the pilot or damages the engine or tears control surfaces is considered a success because it prevents the bomber from accurately releasing weapons. But a kamikaze already committed to crashing into your ship doesn't need to be accurate. He just needs to maintain enough control to reach the target. Minor damage means nothing. Moderate damage means nothing. You must physically destroy the aircraft, shred it into pieces too small to cause harm, or it will hit you. This changes everything. The VT fuse, for all its revolutionary capabilities, detonates when it senses an aircraft within 70 feet. Against a conventional bomber, that's perfect. The blast radius tears control surfaces and kills engines. Against a kamikaze, it's often insufficient. The damaged aircraft, on fire and spinning, still reaches the ship and causes catastrophic damage. American naval commanders quickly realize they need to destroy kamikazes at greater range. The 5-inch guns with VT fuses remain effective, but now they need to fire more rounds per target to ensure complete destruction. Ammunition consumption skyrockets. Ships that might have fired 50 rounds per engagement now fire 500. The Navy also begins to appreciate the limitations of VT technology. The fuses don't work well against targets approaching at very low altitude below 50 feet because they can't distinguish between the aircraft and the ocean surface. They don't work in rain or heavy weather, when water droplets trigger false signals, and they still have that 30% failure rate, meaning 1 in 3 shells is a dud. Against kamikazes, these limitations prove costly. At Okinawa in April and May 1945, despite having VT fuses on virtually every 5-inch gun in the fleet, American ships will suffer staggering losses. 34 ships sunk, 368 damaged, nearly 5,000 sailors killed. The VT fuse helps without it. Casualties would have been far worse. But it doesn't solve the kamikaze problem. That will require different solutions, more combat air patrol fighters, better radar picket systems, ultimately the end of the war itself. Yet, even with its limitations against kamikazes, the VT fuse's impact on the Pacific War is undeniable. Between January 1943 and August 1945, VT-fused ammunition accounts for approximately 278 Japanese aircraft destroyed. Post-war analysis suggests that timed fuses would have destroyed perhaps 46 of those aircraft, about 1/6 as many. More importantly, the VT fuse forces Japan into tactical dead ends. It makes conventional bombing attacks suicidal. It contributes to the decision to adopt kamikaze tactics. And even against kamikazes, it increases the cost to Japan, forcing them to expend more aircraft and more pilots' irreplaceable resources they cannot afford to lose. The human cost of the VT fuse is difficult to calculate. How many American sailors came home because their ship shot down an attacker that timed fuses would have missed? How many Japanese pilots died in aircraft that exploded prematurely, never understanding what killed them? The numbers exist in historical records, but they represent individual lives, individual stories, individual moments of terror and courage and death. What we can say with certainty is that the VT fuse represents one of the most successful weapons development programs in American military history. From initial concept to combat deployment took less than 3 years. Total program cost was approximately $1 billion in 1940s currency, roughly $15 billion today. Over 22 million fuses were manufactured during the war, each containing approximately 130 miniaturized electronic components. And the technology didn't stay confined to naval warfare. The VT fuse's story takes an unexpected turn in June 1944, when German V-1 cruise missiles begin raining down on London. The V-1 Vergeltungswaffe 1, Vengeance Weapon 1, is a pilotless aircraft packed with explosives. It flies straight and level at roughly 400 miles per hour and 2,000 feet altitude. British fighters can shoot them down if they catch them. British anti-aircraft guns can hit them if they calculate the timing perfectly. But the V-1s come in swarms, day and night, and conventional defences are overwhelmed. The British government makes an urgent request. Can American VT fuses be used in anti-aircraft guns defending London? The request triggers an intense debate in Washington. The policy since 1942 has been that VT fuses can only be used over water, where duds won't fall into enemy hands. Using them over land risks giving the Germans access to the technology, but London is dying. In the first weeks of the V-1 campaign, German launches average 120 missiles per day. Many get through, buildings collapse, civilians die. Churchill himself pleads with Roosevelt for access to the American proximity fuses. On June 12, 1944, the combined Chiefs of Staff authorize VT fuse use for air defense of London. Within days, American and British anti-aircraft batteries around London receive the new ammunition. The results are immediate and dramatic. In the first 3 weeks of V-1 attacks, British guns using timed fuses destroyed approximately 24% of missiles engaged. After VT fuses arrive, the kill rate climbs to 79%. The Germans launch 9,300 V-1s between June and August. Nearly 8,000 are destroyed before reaching their targets, the vast majority by VT-fused anti-aircraft fire. The fuses save London. Churchill will later write that the American proximity fuse was the only thing that made V-1 defense possible. British civilians never know the details. The technology remains classified, but they notice that the flying bombs stop getting through, and then the VT fuse goes to ground. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. German forces launch their final major offensive in the west, what will become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Panzer divisions crash through American lines in a desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and capture the port of Antwerp. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, has been asking for months for permission to use VT fuses in ground artillery. The answer has always been no, too much risk of a dud falling into German hands. But now, with German forces advancing and American troops falling back, Eisenhower demands the restrictions be lifted immediately. On December 19th, 3 days after the offensive begins, the combined chiefs authorize unrestricted use of VT fuses in Europe. Within hours, American artillery battalions receive the new ammunition and begin firing. The impact is devastating. Traditional artillery fire requires forward observers to adjust fire, calling in corrections until shells land on target. This process takes time and wastes ammunition. With VT fuses, artillery shells explode automatically at optimal height above ground, creating a lethal rain of shrapnel that doesn't require precision aiming. General George Patton, commanding 3rd Army, writes to the War Department describing the effect. The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. We caught a German battalion trying to cross the Sauer River with a battalion concentration and killed by actual count 702. I think when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare. The VT airburst artillery shells prove particularly effective against German forces caught in the open. Traditional artillery requires direct hits or very close misses to kill. VT shells explode 20 to 30 feet above ground, spraying shrapnel downward in a pattern that's nearly impossible to escape. German soldiers who felt relatively safe in shallow trenches discover that cover designed for traditional artillery is useless. The psychological impact matches the physical destruction. German troops report that American artillery has become impossibly accurate. Some units refuse orders to advance across open ground. The mythology grows American shells that seem to know where you are, that hunt you, that find you no matter where you hide. By the time the Bulge Offensive collapses in January 1945, American artillery has fired approximately 200,000 VT-fused rounds in just 6 weeks. German forces attempting to retreat face what veterans describe as the most intense artillery fire of the entire war. The VT fuse, designed to protect ships from aircraft, has become an instrument of ground warfare that fundamentally changes tactical calculations. But what did the Japanese know? When did they figure it out? August 1945. Shortly after Japan's surrender, American intelligence teams arrive in Tokyo to assess Japanese technical knowledge. Among their priority questions, what did the Japanese understand about the VT proximity fuse? The answer is both surprising and illuminating. Japanese scientists understood the theoretical possibility of radio-based proximity fuses. They'd discussed the concept since the late 1930s. They knew it could be done. What they couldn't figure out was how the Americans made it work. The technical challenges, miniaturizing the electronics, creating vacuum tubes that survive firing, developing reliable detonation circuits had seemed insurmountable to Japanese researchers. Even when they recovered damaged American shells with partially intact fuses, they couldn't reverse engineer the manufacturing processes. The precision required, the quality control, the specialized components all exceeded Japanese industrial capabilities in wartime. More tellingly, Japanese commanders never fully appreciated the VT fuse's impact on their tactical decisions. They knew American anti-aircraft fire had become more effective. They developed countermeasures, lower altitude attacks, higher speeds, eventually kamikaze tactics, but they viewed these as responses to general American technological improvement, not to one specific weapon system. In post-war interrogations, Japanese naval aviation officers consistently underestimate how much the VT fuse contributed to their losses. They attribute their defeats primarily to American numerical superiority, better pilot training, and fighter aircraft performance. The invisible electronic warfare happening inside millions of artillery shells remains, even after the war, somewhat mysterious to them. This speaks to the VT fuse's ultimate success. It was so thoroughly secret, so completely integrated into American weapons systems, that even the enemy being killed by it never fully understood what they were facing. The black magic, as Japanese pilots called it, remained magical even after the magician revealed his tricks. The legacy of the VT proximity fuse extends far beyond World War II. The technology pioneered by Merle Tuve and his team at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory established principles that govern modern smart weapons, today's air defense systems, Patriot missiles, ship-based phalanx close-in weapon systems, even simple infantry portable anti-aircraft missiles all descend directly from the VT fuse. They use more sophisticated sensors, faster computers, more precise guidance, but the fundamental concept remains identical. Give the weapon the ability to sense its target and destroy itself at the optimal moment. The VT fuse also demonstrated something profound about American industrial and scientific capacity during World War II. The Manhattan Project gets more attention. Atomic weapons are inherently dramatic, But the proximity fuse program involved more people, more factories, more individual manufacturing challenges. It required coordinating over 100 contractors to produce 22 million devices, each containing miniaturized components that pushed the boundaries of 1940s technology. And unlike the atomic bomb, which was used twice and then became primarily a deterrent, the proximity fuse was a workhorse weapon that saved lives every day of its deployment. Every VT-fused shell that destroyed an enemy aircraft was an India-Tees, American ship that survived, American sailors who came home, American families that remained intact. The scientists who developed it understood this. Dr. James Van Allen, who spent years perfecting vacuum tubes that could survive 20,000 Gs, later reflected on his wartime work with quiet satisfaction. He'd gone on to discover Earth's radiation belts, work that made him famous. But he always maintained that his contribution to the proximity fuse was equally important because it directly saved lives. Merle Tuve never sought glory for his work. After the war, he returned to Carnegie Institution and focused on geophysics and seismology. He rarely discussed the proximity fuse in public. When pressed, he'd note that it was a team effort, that no single person deserved credit, that the real heroes were the sailors who used the weapons in combat. But those sailors knew. The gun crews who'd watched VT shells destroy attacking aircraft with uncanny precision. The destroyer captains, who'd survived kamikaze attacks because their 5-inch guns could actually kill at range. The thousands of young men who came home from the Pacific because a shell detonated 70 feet from an enemy bomber instead of exploding uselessly in empty sky. They knew that someone, somewhere, had done something miraculous. They knew that the odds had shifted, that the mathematics of survival had changed in their favor. They might not have understood the technology, most never learned the details until decades after the war, but they understood the result. So let's return to where we began. January 5th, 1943. USS Helena, dawn over Guadalcanal. Lieutenant Commander Red Cochran watches 2 Japanese dive bombers disintegrate in mid-air, torn apart by explosions that seem to come from nowhere. What Cochran knows in that moment is that his shells worked. What he doesn't know is that he's witnessing the future of warfare. That the device in his 5-inch shells will spawn technologies that dominate battlefields for the next 80 years. That the principles being proven in the skies over the Solomons will eventually protect American forces from threats that don't yet exist. Cruise missiles, guided bombs, drone swarms. What the Japanese pilots never knew, what they couldn't have known in the seconds before their aircraft came apart, was that they'd been defeated not by superior tactics or braver men, but by scientists who taught metal and glass to think, by engineers who'd solved problems that seemed impossible, by American industrial might applied with precision and purpose. The VT proximity fuse didn't win World War II by itself. No single weapon ever does. But it represents something essential about how that war was fought and won the marriage of scientific innovation and industrial production, of theoretical physics and practical engineering, of civilian researchers and military necessity. It's a story about the moment when near miss became good enough, when close actually did count, when 70 feet became the difference between life and death. It's a story about making the invisible visible, the impossible possible, about turning the sky itself into a weapon. And it's a reminder that sometimes the most revolutionary changes come not from new strategies or better soldiers, but from someone asking a simple question: what if we could make the shell smart enough to know when to explode? The answer to that question, worked out in a converted garage in Silver Spring, Maryland, by physicists and engineers racing against time, changed naval warfare forever. It saved thousands of American lives. It contributed to victory in the Pacific, in Europe, in every theatre where it was deployed. The Japanese pilots, who called it black magic, weren't entirely wrong. There was something almost supernatural about shells that seemed to know where you were, that found you in 3-dimensional space, that detonated at the exact instant to do maximum harm. The magic wasn't supernatural, it was science. But in 1943, to the men dying in the skies over the Pacific, the distinction hardly mattered. What mattered was that the Americans had changed the rules. The sky was no longer safe. The mathematics of attack no longer favoured the attacker. Every approach might be your last, and you'd never know what killed you until it was too late. That's the real story of the VT proximity fuse. Not just a tale of technology, but a story of how innovation shifts the balance of power. How new capabilities force new tactics. How weapons that seem like magic are really just physics, applied with precision and purpose in the service of victory. Lieutenant Commander Cochrane, standing on Helena's deck that January morning, watched the enemy fall from the sky and knew his world had changed. He just didn't know how much. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.